This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is not affiliated with or endorsed by the U.S. Navy or Department of Defense. The airboat slammed hard across a wall of black water, and the German shepherd at the bow did not flinch. Ghost stood rigid against the spray, ears pinned forward, dark fur soaked flat against his muscled frame. Rain drove sideways through the Louisiana night, in sheets so thick the beam of the mounted spotlight dissolved into white haze less than 20 feet from the hull. The cypress trees lining the narrow channel were invisible except when lightning split the sky, and in those brief silver flashes they appeared like the bones of something ancient, draped in moss and leaning low over the water, as if reaching for whatever passed beneath them.
"Fuss," Dawson Briggs said, and the dog pressed against his left leg without hesitation. Dawson kept one hand on the stick that controlled the airboat's rudder, and the other braced against the aluminum rail. The engine behind him roared at half throttle, fighting the current that pushed hard from the south, where the storm surge had been building for hours. Every few seconds, the hull scraped against something beneath the surface, a submerged root or a piece of debris torn loose by the flooding. And Dawson adjusted course by instinct alone, reading the resistance through his feet and the angle of the water against the bow. Ghost barked once. Sharp. Directed. The dog's head swung hard to the left, toward a wall of cane and elephant grass that rose from the waterline like a curtain. His body went rigid, tail level, nose locked on a point somewhere beyond the vegetation. Then he barked again, 3 times in quick succession, a pattern Dawson recognized from years of working with dogs trained to alert on human presence. Dawson killed the throttle. The airboat drifted forward on its own momentum, turning slightly as the current caught the flat hull. Without the engine, the storm filled every inch of silence. Wind screamed through the treetops. Rain hammered the water surface into a boiling white noise. And beneath all of it, thin as a thread pulled taut between 2 points about to snap, came a sound that stopped Dawson's breath in his chest. A voice. Male. Old. Weak. Calling for help. The words were broken apart by the wind, scattered into fragments that might have been nothing more than the storm playing tricks on exhausted ears. But Ghost did not deal in tricks. The dog pressed forward against the bow rail, every muscle drawn tight, waiting. Dawson knew that voice. His jaw tightened. His hand found the throttle again. "All right, boy," he said quietly. "Show me." He pushed the airboat toward the cane wall, toward the voice, toward whatever was waiting in the dark water beyond it. 3 days earlier, the morning had arrived the way most mornings arrived in Bayou, Louisiana. Slowly, and with the particular amber heaviness of late October light filtering through Spanish moss. Dawson Briggs crouched on the wooden dock beside his airboat, a socket wrench turning steadily in his right hand as he worked on the engine's lower housing. He was 42 years old, though the deep lines around his pale blue eyes and the gray threaded through his short, dark beard suggested a man who had carried more years than the calendar accounted for. His shoulders were broad beneath a faded olive work shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and he moved with a deliberate economy of motion, each gesture precise and unhurried,
the kind of physical discipline that did not come from careful thought, but from something trained so deeply into the body that it had become the body itself. His right knee popped audibly as he shifted position on the dock. A dry, cracking sound, like a stick snapped underfoot. He ignored it, the way he ignored most things about himself that had started wearing out. The knee had been a problem since his 4th deployment. A bad landing from a night jump over terrain that turned out to be harder than the briefing suggested. The left shoulder was worse, stiff in the mornings, and aching whenever the barometric pressure dropped, which, in southern Louisiana, meant most days between September and March. He compensated without thinking, reaching with his right hand for things a younger man would have reached for with his left, shifting his weight off the bad knee before the pain had a chance to fully register. Ghost lay on the dock beside him, stretched out on the sun-warmed planks, with his chin resting on his front paws. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, dark sable coat shot through with the faintest silver along the muzzle, his body still carrying the lean, powerful build of the multi-purpose canine he had once been. Even resting, the dog was not truly still. His ears rotated independently, tracking sounds Dawson could not hear, cataloging the bayou's inventory of birds, insects, distant boat engines, and wind through cypress branches. "Hand me that filter, would you?" Dawson said without looking up. Ghost lifted his head, glanced at the toolbox, and set his chin back down. "Worth a shot." The dock belonged to a small plot of waterfront at the southern edge of Bayou Crew, a town that existed more as an idea than a place. A gas station with a bait shop attached. A cafe called Thibodeau's that had been serving the same chicory coffee and boudin for 40 years, under 3 different owners, all of whom happened to be named Thibodeau. A volunteer fire station. A church with a steeple that leaned slightly east, as if it had spent too many hurricane seasons listening to the same wind. The town sat where a parish road dead-ended at the water, and beyond that water, the bayou stretched south and west into a vast, ancient maze of channels, cypress swamps, and marshland that most locals knew only by reputation, and most outsiders did not know at all. Dawson lived at the edge of that maze. His home, if the word applied, was the airboat itself, and a small wooden structure built on cypress stilts above the waterline. The structure had 1 room, a tin roof, and no address. He had built it himself when he arrived 3 years ago with Ghost, a truck he later sold, and nothing in particular to say about where he had come from or why he had stopped here. The people of Bayou Crew had learned quickly that Dawson Briggs answered direct questions with short sentences and indirect questions with silence, and most of them had decided this was acceptable because he always helped when someone's truck got stuck or a dock needed mending, and because the dog was well behaved, and because in a town that small, a quiet neighbor was preferable to a loud one. Ghost stood up. The movement was sudden enough that Dawson looked over. The dog stepped to the edge of the dock, nose down, and began walking with slow deliberation along the weathered planks. His nostrils flared in rapid, focused pulls. He stopped at a point near the far piling where the dock met the muddy bank, and a low growl vibrated in his throat. Dawson set down the wrench and walked over. He crouched beside the dog and looked. Boot prints. 2 sets, pressed deep into the soft mud where someone had stepped off a vessel and onto the bank. The treads were even, heavy,
the kind of waffle pattern stamped into tactical footwear rather than the smooth rubber soles the fishermen around here wore. Beside the prints, a smear of something dark and oily caught the light. Dawson touched it with 2 fingers and rubbed them together. Engine lubricant. Not the 2-stroke mix the local shrimpers used, but a synthetic blend, the kind sold at marine supply stores that catered to larger craft. Ghost looked up at him, waiting. Dawson scanned the dock, the tree line, the water. Nothing moved except a great blue heron lifting off from the far bank. He looked down at the prints again. They pointed toward town, and then back toward the water, as if whoever made them had walked up, looked around, and returned to their boat. "Yeah," he said to Ghost. "I see it." He tucked the information away the same way he had once cataloged the details of a patrol route, automatically and without conclusion, because conclusions required more data, and the data would arrive when it arrived. He wiped his fingers on his jeans and went back to the engine. 20 minutes later, the marine weather radio mounted to the dock piling crackled with a tone that made Ghost's ears rotate forward. Tropical storm advisory. A deepening low-pressure system was moving northwest across the Gulf, expected to bring sustained winds of 50 to 60 miles per hour and up to 14 inches of rain to the coastal parishes over the next 72 hours. Small craft advisory in effect immediately. Residents in low-lying areas were encouraged to prepare. Dawson listened without expression. He had survived weather in places where the concept of shelter did not exist, and a Louisiana storm in October was not going to rearrange his plans. But Ghost had already lifted his nose to the air, nostrils working, reading something the radio could not transmit. The dog's ears flattened briefly, then rose again. His tail dropped a fraction of an inch. "You smell it too, huh?" Dawson said. Ghost looked at him with amber eyes that held the steady, unblinking focus of a dog who had been trained to communicate threat levels without making a sound. The look said what it always said. Something is coming. She arrived the next afternoon, just ahead of the first rain bands. The truck was a white sedan, actually, not a truck. It pulled into the gravel lot beside the bait shop, trailing a thin cloud of dust that the thickening humidity refused to let settle. The woman who stepped out moved quickly, the way people moved when urgency had been sitting in their chest for days and had finally found a direction to go. She was not tall, 5'6" maybe, with dark hair pulled back tight, and the kind of face that carried both exhaustion and determination in equal measure. The shadows beneath her hazel eyes suggesting she had not slept well in some time, while the set of her jaw suggested she did not intend to let that stop her. She wore dark jeans, a gray pullover, and boots that were practical rather than fashionable. A leather medical bag sat on the passenger seat beside her, the brass clasp worn smooth from years of use. Her hands were steady, but her fingers moved against her thigh as she walked toward the cafe, a small rhythmic tapping that betrayed what her face refused to show. Inside Thibodeau's, 3 men sat at the counter nursing coffee. She asked her question directly, without preamble or apology. "I need someone who knows the deep bayou. Someone who can take me in. Today. Before the storm hits." The men exchanged glances. The oldest, a shrimper named Arsenault, whose family had worked these waters for 4 generations, shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, nobody's going deep today. Storm's already pushing water up the channels. Another 12 hours, half them trails gonna be underwater."
"My father has been missing for 3 days," she said. "His name is Remy Thibodeau. He was sheriff of this parish for 30 years. Someone in this town knows the water well enough to help me find him." The name changed the air in the room. Arsenault set down his coffee. The younger man beside him looked away. Everyone in Bayou crew knew Remy Thibodeau, knew him and respected him. The old sheriff had retired 5 years ago and retreated deeper into the bayou after his wife passed, living in a small cabin on a channel most people could not find without a GPS and a prayer. He kept to himself, fished, listened to the radio, and came into town once a month for supplies. When he stopped coming, nobody noticed for the first few days. By the time someone thought to check, the cabin was empty and the weather had turned. Arsenault rubbed the back of his neck. "There's a man lives out on the south dock. Runs airboat tours in season. He knows the water better than most, but he ain't the type to volunteer for much." "Where do I find him?" Dawson did not look up when she walked down the dock. He heard her, of course, heard the particular rhythm of boots on wood that belonged to someone unfamiliar with walking on surfaces that shifted with the water. Heard the slight hesitation in her step when she reached the section of dock where a plank was missing and had been replaced with a piece of marine plywood. He filed the sounds into their proper categories and continued tightening the bolt on the engine housing. "Mr. Briggs." "That's the boat," he said without turning. "Tours don't run in storm season. Come back in April." "I'm not here for a tour. My name is Margot Thibodeau. My father is Remy Thibodeau, the retired sheriff. He's been missing 3 days in the deep bayou, and nobody will take me to find him." Dawson's hand paused on the wrench for exactly 1 second. Then it resumed turning. "Nobody will take you because the deep bayou in a storm will kill you faster than whatever happened to your father. He's 68 years old. He lives alone. He could be hurt or lost or nobody goes into the bayou in weather like this." Silence. The kind that carried weight. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The urgency was still there, but beneath it was something quieter and harder, the sound of a woman who had run out of options and was now standing on the last one. "He's all I have left." Dawson set down the wrench. He still did not turn around. The words sat in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved through places inside him that he kept carefully sealed. A sound came from the dock behind the woman, nails clicking on wood. Ghost walked past Dawson without hesitation, stepped around the toolbox and approached the stranger. Normally, Ghost did not approach strangers. The dog had been trained in a program where unfamiliar humans were assessed, catalogued, and kept at a professional distance, unless a handler gave specific clearance. In 3 years of living in Bayou Crew, Dawson had never seen Ghost voluntarily close the distance with someone he did not know. But the dog walked directly to Margot Thibodeau, stopped in front of her, lifted his nose to her outstretched hand, sniffed once, twice, and wagged his tail. Dawson turned around. Ghost looked back at him, then turned his head toward the far end of the dock, toward the spot where the boot prints from yesterday were still pressed into the mud. The dog held the posture for 3 full seconds, nose pointed, body aligned, the way he oriented when connecting 2 pieces of information that belonged together. Dawson looked at the boot prints, looked at the woman. Tactical boots, synthetic lubricant, Someone had been at this dock recently who did not belong here. And now, an old sheriff was missing in the deep bayou. "When did your father disappear?"
3 days ago, maybe 4. His neighbor went to check when he missed their weekly radio call. 3 days. The boot prints were fresh, no more than 48 hours old. The timing overlapped. Dawson looked at Ghost. The dog looked back with those steady amber eyes that never lied and never guessed. "Get in the boat." The airboat cleared the last of the marked channel 20 minutes after they launched, and the bayou closed around them like a door shutting. Behind them, the open water near town disappeared into a wall of bald cypress and water tupelo draped in Spanish moss so thick it hung like curtains between the trunks. Ahead, the channel narrowed to barely twice the width of the hull, the dark water reflecting the gray sky above in a mirror so perfect that the trees appeared to grow downward into an inverted forest beneath the surface. The air was heavy with moisture, thick enough to taste, carrying the mineral scent of ancient mud and the sharper green smell of vegetation that had been growing and decaying in the same water for centuries. Ghost stood at the bow, ears up, nose working. The dog's posture had shifted the moment they left the dock, from the relaxed awareness of home territory to the alert, forward-leaning stance of a working dog on mission. His nostrils flared in steady rhythm, sampling the air ahead for information that neither the water nor the sky would volunteer. "Stay low when we pass under the branches," Dawson said without looking back. Margot ducked as a thick limb of live oak swept inches above her head, trailing moss that brushed across her shoulders like the fingers of something reaching down from the canopy. She gripped the rail and watched the water line as the boat moved deeper into the maze. "Can we go faster?" "You rush in the bayou, you die in the bayou. The water looks flat, but there are cypress knees and deadfall every 10 feet. Hit one at speed and we roll. Then nobody finds your father. You don't know what it's like to wait 3 days, not knowing if someone you love is alive or dead." Dawson did not answer. His left hand tightened on the rail. The knuckles whitened for just a moment before he relaxed them with conscious effort, the way a man released a fist he had not intended to make. His eyes stayed forward, scanning the waterline where the shadow of the hull moved across the dark surface. Ghost's head snapped left. His body went rigid, ears locked forward, nose pointing at a spot in the water ahead and to port. A low rumble built in his chest, barely audible over the engine. Dawson eased the throttle back and turned the rudder. The airboat slid sideways in the channel, and the spotlight caught the dark shape of a massive cypress knee jutting just below the waterline, invisible from straight on, but deadly if struck at speed. The hull cleared it by less than a foot. Margot stared at the dog. "He does that often?" "He reads the water better than I do." They moved deeper. The channels branched and rebranched, some wide enough for the boat, and some choked with water hyacinth and fallen timber. Dawson navigated without GPS, without chart, reading the current and the canopy, and the way the moss hung differently where air moved through gaps in the trees. It was the same skill set he had used to navigate featureless terrain in places he would never name. The ability to construct a map from details so small
that most people did not register them as information. The sky darkened steadily as the storm's outer bands approached. The air grew restless, small gusts pushing through the moss and sending ripples across the water that had been glass still moments before. The first drops of rain fell, warm and fat, striking the hull with a sound like fingers tapping on a drum. They passed through a narrow cut between two ancient live oaks, whose branches had grown together overhead, forming a tunnel of green and gray. In the shadows beneath, a small wooden cross stood on the bank, half its height swallowed by moss, the wood blackened with age. Someone had planted it there years ago, perhaps decades, for a reason that the bayou had long since absorbed into its own memory. Dawson saw it. He did not slow down. He did not comment. But his eyes rested on it for one beat longer than they rested on anything else. And Ghost turned his head to look at the same moment, as if dog and man had noticed the same still point in the moving world. Then both looked forward again, and the boat carried them deeper into the maze. 40 minutes later, the channel opened into a wider stretch of water bordered by palmetto and elephant grass. On the far bank, partially hidden behind a stand of cypress, a small wooden structure sat on stilts above the waterline. The roof was tin, rusted at the edges. A narrow dock extended from the front, and tied to one of its pilings was a flatboat with an outboard motor, sitting low in the water from the rain that had already begun to collect in its hull. "That's it," Margot said. Her voice had gone quiet, the urgency replaced by something closer to fear. "That's his cabin." Dawson cut the engine and let the airboat drift. He studied the structure from 50 yards out, the way he had studied buildings in other countries before approaching them. The front door was open, not ajar, not swinging in the wind, but fully open, pushed flat against the interior wall. In his experience, people who lived alone in remote places did not leave their doors open unless they had left in a hurry, or had not been the last ones to close them. Ghost had already locked on. The dog's body was rigid, tail level, every line of muscle drawn tight. His nose worked the air in rapid, focused pulls, and a sound came from his throat that was not quite a growl and not quite a whine, but something between the two. The sound of a trained animal processing information that contradicted what he expected to find. "Bleib," Dawson said. "Stay." He tied the airboat to a cypress trunk and stepped onto the bank. His right knee protested the drop with a grinding pop that he absorbed without breaking stride. He approached the cabin from the side, staying below the window line, feet finding the solid ground between mud patches without looking down. Old habits, the kind that lived in the spine rather than the brain. Inside, the cabin looked like someone had searched it with more efficiency than care. The single room had been torn apart in a pattern Dawson recognized immediately. Drawers pulled out and emptied onto the floor. A bookshelf swept clear. The mattress on the small bed pulled halfway off the frame. But the destruction was not random. Whoever had done this had moved systematically from one side of the room to the other, left to right, top to bottom, the way you cleared a space when you knew what you were looking for and knew approximately where it should be. The radio mounted to the wall above the table was destroyed. Not knocked over, not dropped.
destroyed. The housing had been cracked open and the internal components pulled apart. Circuit boards snapped, wires cut. Dawson crouched beside it and studied the cuts. Clean, precise,
made with a blade that had been designed for that kind of work. He had carried a blade like that for 20 years. He stood up and scanned the rest of the room. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Whatever had happened here, Remy Thibodeau had not been inside when the visitors arrived, or he had chosen not to fight them. Margot appeared in the doorway. Her face went pale. "Oh God, don't touch anything." She pressed a hand against the doorframe to steady herself. Her eyes moved across the destruction, the professional part of her mind cataloging details even as the rest of her fought to process what she was seeing. Someone did this. Someone came here and... "At least two," Dawson said. He pointed to the floor near the table. "Two sets of boot prints. Same tread pattern I found on my dock yesterday." He looked at her. "Professional. Amateurs steal things. These people destroyed communication first." The words came out before he could filter them, carrying more tactical certainty than a man who drove an airboat for a living should reasonably possess. Margot looked at him with an expression that shifted from shock to something sharper, a question forming behind her eyes that she was not yet ready to ask. "Ghost, here." The German shepherd stepped into the cabin. Dawson pointed at the floor, at the boot prints, at the overturned furniture. Ghost began to work the room the way he had been trained to work a space, moving in a controlled pattern, nose to the ground, processing scent the way a computer processed data. He paused at the corner near the bed, where an old canvas jacket hung from a hook on the wall. The dog pressed his nose into the fabric and held it there for several seconds. Then his head came up, his ears locked forward. His body turned toward the rear door of the cabin, the one that opened onto a narrow trail leading south, deeper into the bayou. South. Into the darkest, most tangled stretch of wetland in the parish. The channels that flooded first and drained last. The territory where even the local fishermen drew a line on their mental maps and did not cross it. Ghost looked at Dawson with absolute clarity. "He went deeper," Dawson said. Margot stared at the rear door. Why would he go deeper? If he was running from someone, why wouldn't he go toward town? Because whatever's behind him is worse than what's ahead. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the tin roof in a rising rhythm that sounded like the opening bars of something that had not yet decided what kind of song it intended to become. Ghost stood at the rear door, nose pointed south, every line of his body saying the same thing. This way. He went this way, and he went on purpose. Dawson looked at the destroyed radio, at the systematic search pattern, at the clean blade cuts on the wiring that spoke a language he had spent 20 years learning to read. Someone with training, real training, the kind that came from the same pipeline he had graduated from, had come to this cabin looking for something Remy Thibodeau possessed. And Remy, who had spent 30 years as a sheriff and who understood threat assessment in his own right, had looked at what was coming and decided that the deep bayou in hurricane season was safer than staying put. Dawson turned to Margot. "We go south. Stay behind me. Do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, no questions. If Ghost alerts, you freeze. If I say get down, you get down. If I say run, and you don't look back. I'm not leaving without my father. Then don't make me leave without both of you. He stepped out the rear door and into the rain. Ghost was already ahead of him, nose to the trail, following a scent that was 3 days old and fading with every drop of water that fell from the darkening sky. Behind them, the cabin sat empty and torn apart, the front door still open to the storm, and the bayou absorbed the evidence the way it absorbed everything, slowly and completely, and without judgment. The trail behind Remy's cabin lasted less than 100 yards before the ground dissolved into water. Dawson stood at the edge where the packed earth gave way to black marsh, rain running in streams down his face, and read the story the mud told before the water swallowed it. Boot prints, the same size and tread as the ones in the cabin, followed the trail south. But there was a second set underneath them, older, partially filled with rainwater, smaller, the rubber sole pattern of a wading boot, the kind a man who had fished these waters for decades would wear without thinking. Remy had left first. The others had followed. 2 groups, Dawson said. Your father came through here at least a day before they did. He had a head start. Margot crouched beside him, staring at the prints as though they might tell her something the mud had not yet revealed. Rain plastered her dark hair against her temples and ran along the line of her jaw. She did not wipe it away. A day? Is that enough? Depends on how well he knows the channels. He knows them better than anyone alive. Then it might be. Ghost had already moved ahead. The dog worked the edge of the waterline in a tight zigzag pattern, nose low, processing whatever trace scent remained after 3 days of heat and humidity and the first waves of storm rain. The work was harder here than on solid ground, the water constantly diluting and redistributing the chemical signatures that a dog's nose could read the way a human read printed words. But Ghost had been trained for water operations. The dog knew how scent behaved when it rose from submerged surfaces and how current carried it downstream before releasing it in pockets along the banks. Dawson watched him work and felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Ghost shifted into operational mode. It was not worry exactly. It was the heightened awareness of depending on another living creature to do something no machine could replicate. He had felt it with canine partners in operational theaters halfway around the world. That particular blend of trust and attention that made the handler's entire nervous system synchronize with the dog's. When Ghost's ears shifted, Dawson's attention shifted. When Ghost paused, Dawson paused. When Ghost committed to a direction, Dawson committed. Fuss. Ghost returned to his left side, and they moved together into the water. The airboat could not follow where they needed to go. The channel south of the cabin was too narrow and too choked with fallen timber to navigate with a powered vessel. At least, not until the floodwater rose high enough to clear the obstructions, which it would, given another 12 to 18 hours of storm. For now, they waited. The water reached Dawson's shins at first, warm despite the rain, thick with tannins that turned it the color of strong tea. The bottom was uneven, a mixture of decomposed vegetation and clay that sucked at his boots with each step. Spanish moss hung so low in places that he had to push it aside like a curtain, the fibers damp and clinging against his arms. Margot followed 2 steps behind, placing her feet where Dawson placed his. She did not complain about the water or the mud or the branches that scratched across her arms when the channel narrowed. She did not ask how much farther. She moved with the focused determination of a woman who had spent years working in emergency rooms where complaining was a luxury nobody could afford. And Dawson noticed this about her without commenting on it. He also noticed that her breathing stayed controlled even as the water deepened to her thighs, and that she kept her medical bag held above the waterline on her shoulder without being told. She was afraid. He could read it in the tension along her shoulders and the way her eyes moved too quickly across the water surface, looking for threats she could not name. But she was managing it, containing it, using it as fuel rather than letting it become an anchor. There had been operators in the teams who could not do that. They walked for nearly 20 minutes before Ghost stopped. The dog froze mid-stride, one front paw raised above the water, his entire body locked in a point that was aimed not at something on the bank, but at something on the surface of the water itself. Dawson stopped immediately. Margot stopped because Dawson stopped. "Don't move," Dawson said. 15 feet ahead, a log that was not a log lay motionless against the waterline. The shape was nearly invisible in the dark water, only the faintest ridge of scales and the 2 slight bumps of eye sockets breaking the surface. The alligator was large, 8 feet at least, its body partially concealed beneath the overhanging vegetation along the bank. Ghost did not growl. He held the point, waiting for Dawson's decision, the way he had waited for decisions in places where the threats were considerably more complicated than a reptile. "We go right. Slow. No sudden movements." They waded wide around the animal, giving it 20 feet of clearance. The alligator did not move, but its eyes tracked them as they passed. 2 dark points of ancient attention that had been watching things move through this water for decades before any of them were born. When they were clear, Margot exhaled a breath she had been holding. "So that's what worse than whatever's behind him looks like." Dawson almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction and then returned to its default position, which was the same as its position for every other emotion he experienced, level and controlled and giving nothing away. Ghost picked up the trail again, 100 yards past the alligator. The dog moved with renewed confidence, his nose locked onto a scent line that ran along the left bank where the current pushed organic material into a slow eddy. He was reading Remy Thibodeau's passage through the bayou the way a tracker read footprints in dry sand, following not the physical impression, but the chemical memory of a man who had walked through this water days ago and left traces that only an animal with 220 million olfactory receptors could detect. The rain intensified. What had been a steady downpour became a wall of water, so thick that Dawson could barely see Ghost 10 feet ahead. The wind had found the channels now, and was pushing through them in gusts that bent the smaller trees sideways and sent waves of spray off the surface that mixed with the rain until there was no distinction between water falling from the sky and water rising from below. They were running out of daylight. The storm was accelerating, and somewhere ahead of them, in the deepest, most unforgiving stretch of the Louisiana bayou, a 68-year-old man was hiding from something that had sent trained men to silence him. "Stay close, boy." Ghost pressed against his leg, and they moved forward into the gray. They found shelter as darkness fell, though shelter was a generous word for the hollow beneath the fallen cypress trunk that had lodged against a stand of water oaks at an angle steep enough to create a pocket of relatively dry ground underneath. Dawson tested the trunk's stability by pushing against it with his good shoulder, and when it did not shift, he guided Margot underneath and pulled a compact waterproof tarp from his pack. He rigged it between the trunk and the lower branches using paracord and knots that his hands tied without consulting his memory, the way a pianist's fingers found chords in the dark. The result was imperfect, but functional. A space roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide where they could sit upright and stay mostly dry while the storm raged above them. Ghost squeezed in beside Dawson and shook himself vigorously, sending a spray of water across both humans. Margot flinched and then laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle even her. "Your dog has terrible timing." "His timing is perfect. He waited until we were under cover." The dog circled once in the narrow space and lay down between them, his head resting on Dawson's thigh, his tail curled against Margot's knee. In the small orange light of the compact lantern Dawson produced from his pack, Ghost's eyes gleamed like 2 coins of burnished gold. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The rain hammered the tarp above their heads in a constant roar, and the wind moved through the treetops with a sound like something large and restless turning in its sleep. The bayou at night was a different world than the bayou by day. The darkness absolute, except for the lantern's small circle. The sounds amplified and layered until the ordinary noises of water and wind became indistinguishable from the sounds of things moving through the darkness with purpose. "You knew those boot prints meant something," Margot said. "Before I even told you about my father, you already knew something was wrong." "I knew someone had been at my dock who didn't belong there. That's not what I asked." "I notice things. It's a habit. Habits don't read boot treads and engine lubricant. Training does." Dawson said nothing. Ghost's ear twitched in the silence. Margot pulled her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them, looking at the dog instead of the man. "You don't have to tell me. I'm not asking because I want your life story. I'm asking because my father is out there, and I need to know if the person I'm trusting to find him actually knows what he's doing." "I was someone who followed orders for a long time. Then I stopped following them. The noticing part stayed. That's all you need right now." Margot studied him in the lantern light. Whatever she saw in his face, she accepted it. She nodded once and looked away, out into the darkness beyond the tarp, where the rain fell without ceasing. Ghost shifted his weight, pressing his head more firmly against Dawson's leg. The dog's breathing had slowed to the deep, even rhythm of an animal who trusted his environment enough to rest, even in a storm, because the human beside him was awake and watching. It was the same trust he had carried since the day he arrived in Dawson's life. A retired working dog handed over by a handler from a program Dawson never fully explained. Ghost had stepped off the transport, looked at Dawson, sniffed his hand once, and sat down at his feet as if he had been waiting his entire life for exactly this person. "Hey," Dawson said quietly, and the dog's tail moved once against Margot's knee. Good boy. 2 words, the softest sound he had made all day. Margot heard them and looked at the man's hand resting on the dog's neck, fingers moving gently through the wet fur. And something in her expression changed in a way she could not have named and did not try to. The storm continued. The bayou waited. And somewhere to the south, in the deepest dark of the wetland, the man they were looking for was still breathing, still hiding, still holding a secret that had already cost him everything, except the will to survive long enough for someone to come find him. Ghost closed his eyes. Dawson did not. Morning did not arrive in the bayou so much as the darkness diluted. The rain had not stopped. It had changed character overnight, trading the violent downpour for a steady, patient fall that sounded like static on an untuned radio. The wind had dropped enough that individual sounds became distinguishable again. The drip of water from branch to branch through the canopy. The low gurgle of current pushing through submerged root systems. The distant mechanical groan of a tree somewhere to the south, leaning past the point its roots could hold. Dawson had not slept. He sat with his back against the fallen cypress trunk, the tarp sagging inches above his head with the weight of collected rainwater, and watched the darkness thin into gray shapes that became trees, became water, became the world he had agreed to walk into. His left shoulder had stiffened during the night into a solid knot of protest that ran from the base of his neck to the middle of his shoulder blade, and his right knee had swollen enough that he could feel the joint pressing against the inside of his boot. He flexed both without expression, measuring the damage the way a mechanic tested an engine, not with hope, but with the need to know what he had left to work with. Ghost was already awake. The dog lay motionless beside him, but his eyes were open, ears rotating slowly, cataloging the bayou's morning inventory. When Dawson shifted position, Ghost lifted his head immediately and looked at him with a question that required no translation. Yeah, time to move. Margot stirred beneath the jacket Dawson had laid over her shoulders at some point during the night, a gesture he had performed without thinking and would not have acknowledged if asked. She opened her eyes and for a moment seemed not to know where she was. Then the sound of the rain and the smell of the swamp and the sight of the German shepherd watching her from 3 feet away brought everything back at once, and her expression hardened with the same controlled urgency she had carried since arriving in Bayou Crew. How long was I out? Few hours. Storm dropped a notch around 3. Water still rising, but slower. She sat up and pushed her wet hair back with both hands, wincing as her neck protested the angle she had slept at. Her eyes went to the waterline, which had crept visibly closer during the night. What had been 6 feet of mud between their shelter and the nearest standing water was now less than 2. We need to keep going. We do. Dawson broke down the tarp shelter in under a minute, rolling the cord and fabric into a tight bundle that disappeared into his pack with the efficiency of someone who had packed and unpacked 1,000 times in places where 30 extra seconds could change an outcome. He handed Margot a protein bar from the pack without comment. She took it without comment. The transaction carried the particular efficiency of 2 people who had silently agreed that conversation was a luxury the morning could not afford. Ghost led them south. The dog worked with renewed intensity in the gray light, nose sweeping the waterline in broad arcs that covered the channel from bank to bank. The scent trail was degrading. 3 days of rain and rising water had diluted the chemical signature Remy Thibodeau left behind, and Ghost had to work harder for each confirmation, pausing longer at each detection point, circling back to verify before committing forward. But he did not lose the trail. The dog's focus was absolute, the kind of concentration that had been bred into his bloodline for generations and refined by a training program that accepted only animals capable of maintaining mission performance under conditions that would overwhelm most humans. Dawson watched the dog work and matched his own pace to Ghost's rhythm. Fast when the scent was strong, slower when Ghost needed to search. Behind him, Margot kept up without being asked to, wading through water that now reached their waists in the deeper sections, her medical bag held above the surface on her shoulder. They had been moving for nearly an hour when Ghost stopped. The dog's body locked mid-stride, right front paw raised above the water, every muscle drawn tight in a full-body alert that Dawson had seen perhaps a dozen times in the 3 years they had been together. Ghost was not pointing at a scent. He was pointing at a sound. "Bleib," Ghost held. Dawson raised his hand behind him, palm flat, and Margot stopped without needing to be told what the signal meant. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. The rain fell. The water pushed gently past their legs. And from somewhere ahead and to the right, muffled by the dense vegetation and the steady hiss of rainfall, came the low throb of a boat engine idling. Dawson tilted his head a fraction, isolating the sound the way he had been trained to isolate sounds in environments where every noise was either information or deception. The engine was a 4-stroke outboard, mid-range horsepower, running at low RPM. Not a shrimp boat, not a fishing skiff. The pitch was too clean, the idle too smooth. A newer engine on a well-maintained vessel. He eased sideways to the bank and pressed his back against a cypress trunk, pulling Margot in beside him. Ghost moved with them, silent, body low against the water. Through a gap in the palmetto, Dawson could see a section of the wider channel that intersected their route about 50 yards ahead. A bass boat sat in the channel with its engine running. 2 men aboard. The first man stood at the bow with a pair of binoculars raised to his eyes, scanning the tree lines slowly, left to right, the way a person scanned when they were looking for something specific rather than surveying the landscape. He was tall and thin, with a narrow face partially hidden beneath the hood of a dark rain jacket. His posture carried a quality that Dawson recognized immediately. The particular stillness of someone trained to remain in one position for extended periods, without shifting weight or adjusting stance. It was a discipline that required practice. Regular people fidgeted. The second man sat at the stern near the engine, shorter and heavier, with a shaved head and thick hands resting on his knees. He wore no hood despite the rain. His eyes moved in a different pattern than his companions, not scanning the tree line, but watching the water surface and the banks on both sides simultaneously, covering the angles his partner could not see. It was a 2-man observation pattern, overlapping fields of view. Basic, but effective. Don't move. Don't speak. Ghost's growl was so low it was more vibration than sound, a frequency that traveled through the water, pressing against Dawson's legs rather than through the air. The dog's lips had pulled back just enough to show the tips of his canines, and his eyes were locked on the tall man with the binoculars with an intensity that said everything his silence did not. "Easy," Dawson whispered to the dog. "Easy." The tall man lowered the binoculars and turned to speak to his companion. The words did not carry across the distance, lost in the rain and the engine noise, but the body language was clear enough. A shake of the head, a gesture south, a decision made. The shorter man adjusted the throttle, and the boat began to move, sliding south along the channel with the unhurried patience of people who had time and resources and were not worried about being late. As the boat turned, Dawson caught a detail that tightened something in his chest. The tall man stepped from the bow to the center console, and his foot led the movement. Right foot first, weight transferring through the ball of the foot to the heel in a controlled motion that prevented the body from rocking the vessel. It was a small thing, insignificant to anyone who had not spent years on boats with men whose lives depended on moving without creating unnecessary motion. But Dawson had spent those years, and he recognized the footwork as reflexive rather than learned, the kind that came from thousands of hours on small craft in operational conditions. These men had not learned to move like that from a weekend fishing trip. He waited a full 2 minutes after the engine sound faded before he spoke. "They're gone. For now." Margot exhaled a breath she had been holding so long her hands were shaking. "Who are they?" "They said they were county search and rescue when we ran into them yesterday." "They're not." "Yesterday? You saw them before?" "They approached us on the water yesterday afternoon, offered to help. Ghost didn't like them then either." He looked at the channel where the boat had been. "There's no county search for your father. I checked before we left the dock. Whatever those two are doing out here, it's not rescue." Margot's face went pale beneath the rain. "Then who?" "And they move like they've cleared a lot of rooms together. The way the tall one uses binoculars, the way the short one covers the angles his partner can't see. That's not something you learn at a search and rescue volunteer seminar." "How would you know what that looks like?" The question hung in the rain between them. Ghost looked from Margot to Dawson and back, ears tracking the conversation the way he tracked everything, with patient, unwavering attention. "The same way I know those boot prints at my dock match the ones in your father's cabin. The same way I know the cuts on his radio were made by a blade designed for disabling communication equipment." He met her eyes. "Because I've used the same tools. A long time ago." Margot stared at him. The rain ran down her face in thin streams that could have been tears if either of them had been the kind of person who noticed tears in a rainstorm. She did not ask more. She did not need to. The shape of the truth was clear enough without the details. "Can you get us past them?" "I already have a route. Ghost and I stay off the main channels from here. They can't follow where we're going." "Then let's go." The deeper they went, the less the bayou resembled anything that belonged to the world they had left behind. The channels narrowed until the vegetation on both sides nearly touched overhead. The water beneath was black and still, the canopy so dense that rain reached them only as a secondary drip. Ancient cypress trunks rose from the water like columns in a cathedral that no one had built and no one maintained, but that endured nonetheless. Ghost moved ahead with his nose to the water, following a trail that was now so faint that each confirmation took minutes instead of seconds. The dog would stop, lower his muzzle until it nearly touched the surface, hold perfectly still, and then move forward again with a certainty that defied the condition of the evidence he was processing. Dawson watched him without interfering. The dog knew his job better than any verbal command could improve it. They stopped to rest on a section of elevated bank where a fallen tree had collected enough debris to create a small island of relatively solid ground. Margot sat on the trunk and opened her medical bag to check the contents. Dawson stood at the waterline, scanning the channels to the south and west with the methodical patience of a man who did not trust silence to mean safety. "He loved this place," Margot said. Dawson did not turn around, but his head tilted slightly, listening. "My father. He used to bring me out here when I was a girl, before sunrise, in a pirogue so old the wood was soft. We'd sit in the channels and watch the herons wake up. He'd tell me the names of everything, every bird, every tree, every fish. He knew them the way some people know the streets of the city they grew up in." She paused. "I left when I was 18. Told myself I'd come back." "Told him I'd come back. And you didn't. My mother got sick 2 years ago. I was going to come home. I was going to take time off from the hospital and spend a month here, help my father, be with her. She died on a Tuesday. I was in an operating room in the city. I didn't make it back in time." Ghost, who had been lying on the bank beside Dawson's feet, stood and walked to Margot. The dog pressed his head against her knee, and when she looked down, his amber eyes held the steady, wordless presence that was more eloquent than any condolence a human could construct. Margot placed her hand on the dog's broad skull and exhaled, a slow release that carried the weight of something she had been holding for longer than 2 years. Dawson watched from the waterline without speaking. Something in the scene pulled at him with a gravity he did not want to acknowledge, the image of the dog offering what the man could not. Ghost had always known when to close the distance that Dawson could not. It was the dog's gift and Dawson's limitation. And in 3 years he had never found a way to reconcile the two. "My mother used to say these oaks remember every prayer ever whispered under them," Margot said. She was not speaking to Dawson, exactly. She was speaking to the bayou, or to the dog, or to whatever part of the air still carried her mother's voice. She believed the water kept things, not just what fell into it, but what people brought with them. Grief, hope, promises they meant to keep. Dawson heard the words and did not respond, but he heard them. Ghost's head came up suddenly from Margot's knee. His ears rotated forward, locked. His nose lifted to catch something that had arrived on the shifting air, and a sound came from his throat. Not a growl, not a bark, but a thin, focused whine that Dawson had learned to interpret as recognition. The dog had found fresh scent. "He's close," Dawson said. "Ghost doesn't whine like that unless the trail is hours old, not days." Margot was on her feet instantly. The grief in her face had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something fiercer. the expression of a woman who had failed to reach one parent in time and was not going to let it happen twice. "Which way?" Ghost answered before Dawson could. The dog stepped into the water and moved south with a confidence that had been absent for the last hour, his stride lengthening, his body leaning forward with the urgency of an animal that knew the difference between following a trail and closing in on its source. The scent trail led them to a stretch of bank where someone had stopped to rest. Dawson read the signs while Ghost continued working the perimeter. A patch of ground where leaves and mud had been compressed by weight. A strip of cloth, dark blue, torn from what might have been a shirt, wadded and stained brown with dried blood. The remains of a small fire, already cold, the ashes scattered by rain but not yet fully dissolved. Whoever had built it had kept it small and burned only dry hardwood, the kind that produced minimal smoke. A fire built by someone who knew they might be watched. He rested here, maybe 6-8 hours ago. Dawson pointed at the compressed ground. Sat against that root for a while. The cloth is a field bandage, ankle or lower leg, based on the length and the way it was torn. He's hurt. Hurt but mobile. The footprints leaving this spot are steady. Even stride, consistent depth. He's favoring one leg, but he's not dragging it. He stood and looked south, where Ghost was already pointing. And he's still moving with purpose. These aren't the tracks of a man who's lost. If he's not lost, then what is he doing? Why is he going deeper instead of coming home? Dawson did not answer immediately. He was looking at the footprints with the particular focus he brought to any situation where the evidence contradicted the assumption, and the assumption was collapsing. He had come into this bayou believing they were searching for a lost old man, a retired sheriff who had gone too deep, stayed too long, and gotten turned around by weather he was too proud to respect. That was the story that made sense. That was the story Margot had told, and the story Dawson had accepted, because accepting it required nothing from him except his skill with a boat and his dog's nose. But the footprints did not tell that story. The stride was measured, consistent. The spacing between left and right matched the gait of someone walking with purpose toward a destination they had already chosen. There was no wandering, no circling, no doubling back. Remy Thibodeau had not stumbled deeper into the bayou because he was confused or injured or disoriented by the storm. He had walked into it the way a man walks into a building he has entered 100 times before, deliberately, knowingly, with a plan. "He's not lost," Dawson said. The words came out flat, stripped of everything except the certainty behind them. He knows exactly where he's going. The midpoint of everything Dawson had understood about this search shifted like a compass needle finding a new north. This was not a rescue. It had never been a rescue. They were following a man who had chosen the bayou over his own home, because his home had become more dangerous than a flooding swamp in hurricane season. And whatever danger had driven Remy Thibodeau into these channels was the same danger that had sent men with tactical boots and military-grade tracking hardware to find him. Because home is where they'd find him first. Margot's breath caught. Dawson crouched beside the fire pit and touched the ashes. Cold and wet, but beneath the surface layer, his fingers found warmth still trapped in the soil where the heat had soaked in.
He brushed the top layer aside and found something else. A series of marks scratched into the mud beside the fire with a stick or a fingertip. Letters. Crude, half-washed by rain, but legible if you knew what you were looking at. N-O-T-S-A-F-E. 2 words, scratched into the ground beside a dead fire in the middle of a bayou that most people did not know existed, by a man who had been a sheriff for 30 years and who understood that sometimes the only way to communicate was to leave a message for whoever came looking. He knew someone would follow him, Margot whispered. He knew, and he left this for them. Dawson stood. Not for us, for whoever he's running from. A message that says he knows what they know, that there's no point in catching him because the information is already out there. He looked at Margot. It's a bluff, and it's a smart one, because it means anyone who finds this has to ask themselves whether silencing him still solves the problem. Does it? Depends on whether it's true. Ghost had returned from working the perimeter and now stood at the edge of the bank with his nose pointed directly south and his body trembling with the particular energy of a dog that was close enough to its target that the scent was no longer a trail, but a presence. The whine came again, higher this time, more insistent. He's close, Dawson said. Within a few hours, maybe less. Ghost is reading real-time scent now, not residual. Margot looked at the scratched words in the mud, at the blood-stained cloth, at the dog quivering with the need to move forward. Then we don't stop. They did not stop. The rain intensified again as the storm's center drew closer to the coast, pushing bands of heavy weather inland in waves that arrived without warning and lasted anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. The water in the channels rose steadily, swallowing landmarks that had been visible an hour before, covering root systems and low banks until the bayou became a single, continuous sheet of dark water, interrupted only by the trunks of trees old enough to stand above the flood. Dawson navigated by reading the current. Where the water moved fastest, the channel was deepest, and the passage was clear. Where it eddied and circled, obstructions lay beneath the surface. He had learned to read water in operational theaters where the difference between a navigable approach and a dead end was measured in the ripple pattern 6 inches ahead of his position. And the bayou, for all its differences, obeyed the same physics. Ghost swam the deeper sections, his powerful body cutting through the current with the efficiency of an animal designed for water work. In the shallower stretches he walked, nose alternating between the water surface and the air above it, cross-referencing the scent information from both sources in a process that was invisible to the humans behind him, but that produced results with mechanical reliability. 40 minutes after leaving the rest site, Ghost stopped at a section of bank where a massive live oak had toppled sideways, its root ball torn from the earth and its crown submerged in the channel. The fallen tree created a natural barrier that blocked the passage from bank to bank, and the water backed up behind it in a dark pool that was deeper and stiller than the surrounding current. Ghost did not alert on scent. He alerted on something else. The dog's head tilted sideways, ears cupped forward, and he froze in a posture Dawson had only seen when Ghost was processing mechanical sound. Engine, electronics, something manufactured. Dawson waded forward and ducked beneath the root ball. On the far side, Caught in the branches of the fallen tree where the current had pushed it was a small object encased in waterproof black plastic. He reached into the branches and pulled it free. It was the size of a deck of cards, sealed with rubber gaskets, a small antenna stub protruding from one end. He turned it over in his hands. The casing was unmarked, but the design was familiar in a way that settled cold and heavy in his stomach. No commercial logo, no FCC compliance sticker, no serial number visible on the exterior. The housing was injection-molded polymer with a matte finish designed to reduce visual signature, and the antenna was a flexible rubber stub tuned for a specific frequency band rather than the broad-spectrum reception of a consumer device. GPS tracker, he said. Margot moved closer. Where did that come from? From our boat. They put it on the hull before we left, probably while we were in your father's cabin. He turned the device over once more. The anger was not visible on his face. It lived somewhere deeper, in the part of him that processed betrayal and threat as overlapping categories. This is not commercial hardware. You don't buy this at a marine store. This is the kind of equipment that gets issued. Military-grade location tracking designed for operational environments. Military? Government adjacent. Private security. Defense contractors. He looked at her. Whoever is looking for your father has access to resources that come from the same world I came from. The words landed in the rain between them with the weight of a door closing on a room that could not be reopened. Margot stared at the device in his hand, and when she looked back at his face, whatever she saw there told her more about who Dawson Briggs had been than any number of direct questions could have extracted. These guys have training, real training, and they have resources that don't come from any county budget. He threw the tracker into the deepest part of the pool behind the fallen tree. It disappeared without a sound. From now on, we stay off any channel wide enough for their boat. Ghost leads. No lights after dark. No fire. If they're tracking us by GPS, they just lost the signal. But that means they'll switch to visual search. And in this weather, that means they'll have to get close. He looked at her with eyes that had gone flat, in the way that eyes go flat when a man stops being a civilian and becomes something else. Stay behind me. Do what I say. No exceptions. Margot nodded. There was no argument left in her, not because she had surrendered it, but because she had recognized, with the clinical clarity of a woman trained to assess situations under pressure, that the man standing in front of her was operating from a place she could not reach and did not need to understand. She only needed to trust it. Ghost was already moving. The dog had processed the threat assessment faster than either human and had arrived at the same conclusion that Dawson was still articulating. South, off the main channels. Deeper into the bayou where the water was too shallow for a powered vessel and the vegetation was too dense for visual surveillance from a distance. They moved. The afternoon dissolved into a continuous gray present tense in which time was measured not by hours but by distance traveled and water risen. The channels narrowed to corridors of dark water between walls of cane and palmetto. The canopy closed overhead until the rain reached them only as a secondary drip filtered through layers of leaves and moss. The light dimmed to the point where Dawson navigated as much by touch and sound as by sight, feeling the current against his legs, listening to the way Ghost's breathing changed when the dog detected something ahead.
Twice, Ghost alerted on the distant sound of an engine, and both times Dawson pressed against the nearest trunk and waited, motionless, until the sound passed. The boat was searching a grid pattern, working the wider channel systematically. Without the GPS tracker, the search had become broader and less efficient, but the men aboard were not amateurs. They were working the water the way you worked a problem when you had been trained to treat patience as a tactical advantage. Dawson recognized the pattern. Not just recognized it, knew it, had used it, had taught it to junior operators during pre-deployment workups in environments not so different from this one. The grid search with overlapping legs, the use of natural choke points to funnel the target into predictable routes, the patience to run the pattern for hours without deviating. He had seen that formation before, a lifetime ago, with someone he had trusted. The thought arrived uninvited and stayed. He pushed it aside, the way he pushed aside the pain in his shoulder and the ache in his knee, not by resolving it, but by placing it behind the immediate task. Find Remy, get out of the bayou, deal with the rest later. Ghost looked back at him from 10 feet ahead, amber eyes catching what little light filtered through the canopy. The dog's expression carried no doubt, no second-guessing, no complicated emotional architecture. It carried only the simple, complete certainty of an animal who knew what his job was and trusted the man behind him to handle everything else. "Good boy," Dawson murmured. "Keep going." Ghost turned and disappeared into the green dark ahead of them, and Dawson followed, and Margot followed Dawson, and the bayou swallowed their passage the way it swallowed everything, without trace and without judgment, keeping its own counsel in the ancient silence beneath the oaks. The light failed early. By 4 in the afternoon, the sky had gone dark enough that the distinction between day and approaching night was academic. The storm had not weakened. If anything, the rain had found a rhythm that suggested permanence rather than passing. A steady, mechanical drumming that erased the possibility of silence and replaced it with a white noise that became, after hours of exposure, a kind of silence in itself. Dawson's body was beginning to send signals he could not ignore. The shoulder had progressed from stiff to actively painful, a deep ache that radiated down his left arm and up into his neck whenever he lifted it above his waist. The knee had swollen to the point where each step required a conscious negotiation between the joint's willingness to bend and the terrain's insistence that it must. He compensated without speaking, shifting his weight, adjusting his stride, managing the damage with the practiced indifference of a man who had operated through worse and would operate through worse again if the situation required it. Margot was flagging too, though she concealed it with the same discipline she had shown all day. Her steps had shortened. Her breathing was audible between the gusts. The medical bag on her shoulder had shifted from one side to the other 3 times in the last hour as fatigue migrated through her body, looking for a muscle group that had not yet been exhausted. Ghost remained Ghost, tireless, focused, driven by a biochemistry that prioritized mission over comfort, and by a bond with the man behind him that transcended the physical limitations both of them carried. The dog moved through the water with the same efficient stroke he had used that morning, ears up, nose working, every cell in his body oriented toward the singular purpose of following a scent trail to its source. They were close. Dawson could feel it in the way Ghost moved, the increasing frequency of the dog's confirmations, the shortening intervals between scent detections. Remy Thibodeau was somewhere within a mile of them, possibly less, hidden in a bayou that was rapidly disappearing beneath rising floodwater. And somewhere behind them, or beside them, or ahead of them on a parallel channel, two men in a bass boat were looking for the same person. The math was simple and unforgiving. Dawson's group was slower, injured, and on foot. The search team had a powered vessel, electronics, and the advantage of not caring whether Remy survived the encounter, as long as whatever he knew died with him. But Dawson had Ghost, and Ghost had the trail. The dog paused at the entrance to a channel so narrow that the vegetation on both sides met overhead in a tunnel of green and brown. Water pushed through the opening with a current that suggested the channel widened somewhere beyond. Ghost stood at the entrance, nose lifted, processing. Then his tail rose a fraction, not a wag, not excitement, but the controlled elevation that indicated a positive confirmation of the scent he had been following for 2 days across 30 miles of flooded wetland. "He went through there," Dawson said. Margot looked at the tunnel of vegetation. It was dark inside, the kind of dark that did not invite entry. "Then so do we." Ghost entered first. Dawson followed. Margot followed Dawson. The vegetation closed behind them like a door. Inside the tunnel, the sound changed. The rain, which had been a constant companion for 2 days, became muted, filtered through the dense canopy overhead, into a soft, irregular dripping that sounded like a clock keeping its own time. The water was waist deep and warm, moving slowly through the narrow passage with a current so gentle it was barely perceptible against their legs. The roots of the trees on either side reached across the channel beneath the surface like interlocked fingers, and Dawson felt his way over them with his boots, testing each step before committing his weight. Ghost moved ahead in the near darkness, a shadow among shadows, guided by something beyond sight. The dog's nostrils flared in constant, rapid pulls, processing scent information at a rate that made every other navigational tool irrelevant. He did not hesitate, did not pause. The trail was strong now. Not the faded residue of days-old passage, but the rich, layered chemical signature of a living human who was close enough that the bayou had not yet had time to absorb and dilute his presence. The tunnel opened. They emerged into a wider space, a clearing of sorts, where 3 or 4 large trees had fallen in a previous storm and created an open area of water and sky. The rain fell directly here, hard and straight, and the light, what remained of it, was brighter than anything they had seen in hours. On the far side of the clearing, half hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and a thick stand of cane, a structure sat above the waterline, on wooden pilings that had been sunk into the mud years, perhaps decades ago. It was a cabin, smaller than Remy's, barely more than a single room with a tin roof and no windows. The wood was gray with age, and the roof was patched with tar paper that had been applied recently enough to still be dark against the weathered tin. A narrow plank walkway, also elevated on pilings, connected the cabin to the bank where the channel deepened. The walkway was underwater now, submerged by the flood to a depth of perhaps 8 inches. but the cabin itself sat above the waterline, its floor elevated enough to have survived this storm and probably every storm before it. A thin line of light leaped from beneath the door. Ghost stopped at the edge of the clearing. His tail rose. His body went completely still, except for the barely visible tremor running through his haunches. The involuntary physical response of a trained working dog that had reached the end of a trail and was waiting for the command to close the final distance. Dawson placed his hand on the dog's back and felt the tremor through his palm. He looked at the light beneath the door, at the recently patched roof, at the walkway that had been maintained by someone who intended to use this place again. "Bleib," he said to Ghost. "Stay." Then to Margot, without turning. "Stay here, both of you." "Dawson, I go first. If anything happens, you take Ghost and go north. Don't argue with me. Not now." He did not wait for her response. He stepped into the clearing, alone, and walked toward the cabin where the light leaked out and the rain fell, and the bayou held its breath around him like a living thing, waiting to see what would happen next. The plank walkway creaked once beneath his weight. He reached the door. He pushed it open, and there, sitting against the far wall with his left leg splinted and bound with strips of cloth and branches, his weathered face lit by the small flame of a kerosene lamp, his eyes sharp and alert, despite everything the last 3 days had demanded of him, sat Remy Thibodeau. The old man looked at Dawson, looked past him to the darkness outside where the rain fell, looked at his face with the careful assessment of a man who had spent 30 years reading strangers and deciding within seconds whether they carried help or harm. "I was wondering when someone would find me," Remy said. His voice was hoarse and thin, but his gaze was steady. "I just didn't think it'd be someone I've never met." A bark from behind Dawson. Short, insistent. Ghost had broken the stay command and was standing at the edge of the walkway, tail wagging once, as if to announce that he had done his part and the rest was up to the humans. Remy's eyes shifted to the dog. Something in his expression softened. "Well, I'll be. You brought a dog." "He brought me." The rain fell, the lamp burned, and somewhere in the bayou behind them, the sound of an engine, distant but unmistakable, began to grow. The engine sound grew the way distant thunder grew, not suddenly, but with a steady accumulation of presence that compressed the air around them until ignoring it was no longer a choice. Dawson turned from Remy toward the open door. Through the rain and the hanging moss, across the clearing where the flood had turned the bayou into a single dark lake, interrupted only by tree trunks and the shells of drowned undergrowth. The sound was coming from the northeast, the direction they had come from, the direction that led back to the wider channels where a powered vessel could move freely. Ghost was already at the walkway's edge, ears locked forward, body low. The dog had shifted from the relaxed tail wag of a completed search to a full tactical alert in the time it took Dawson to cross the room. "Inside, now. Bring Ghost." Margot moved without hesitation. She ducked through the doorway, Ghost pressing close beside her, and Dawson followed, pulling the door shut behind him. The cabin was perhaps 10 feet by 12, the air thick with the smell of kerosene and old wood, and the sour, metallic scent of a wound that had been bandaged but not properly cleaned. The only light came from the lamp on the floor beside Remy, its flames small and steady behind a glass chimney darkened with soot. Dawson scanned the room in 2 seconds. One door, no windows. The walls were single-layer plank construction, gaps between the boards wide enough to see through in places. The floor was raised 4 feet above the waterline on cypress pilings. The roof was tin. There was no back exit. "How many are looking for you?" Remy studied him with the evaluating calm of a man who had conducted 1,000 interrogations and recognized the tone of someone who had been on the other side of similar questions. "You tell me who you are first." "Dawson Briggs. Your daughter hired me to find you." "Margot is here?" "I'm here, Papa." Margot crossed the small room in 2 steps and knelt beside her father. Her hand found his, and for 3 seconds neither of them spoke. Remy's fingers closed around hers with a grip that trembled, and his eyes, which had held steady through 3 days alone in a flooding bayou, filled with something that was not quite tears, but was closer to tears than anything else had brought them. Margot pressed her forehead against his knuckles and exhaled a single breath that carried the weight of 2 years of silence and 1,000 miles of distance, and every phone call she had meant to make but hadn't. "I'm sorry I took so long." "You're here now." "That's enough." Then the look on Remy Thibodeau's face changed. The tenderness did not disappear, but it was joined by something harder. Fear. Raw and immediate, and directed not at his own situation, but at the presence of his daughter in a place he had specifically chosen because he believed no one he loved would find him there. "You shouldn't be here. Either of you. They're already close. I need answers, and I need them fast. How many?" Remy's jaw tightened. "2 that I've seen. But they work for someone. Someone with resources." "What kind of resources?" "The kind that makes people disappear." Margot knelt beside her father and opened her medical bag. Her hands moved with the automatic precision of an emergency room physician even as her eyes glistened. She began unwrapping the makeshift splint, her fingers gentle despite the speed. The ankle beneath was swollen and discolored, deep purple fading to yellow at the edges. Not broken, Dawson noted from where he stood, but badly sprained, possibly with ligament damage. Mobile, but slow. Too slow to run. "Papa, I need to clean this properly. Hold still." Remy's eyes had not left the door. 8 years ago, 4 men from this parish went missing. Veterans. Good men. Their families were told they died. Car accident, drowning, hunting accident. Different stories for different people, but all 4 within the same 6 months. I was still sheriff then. I knew something was wrong. The stories didn't hold, but I couldn't prove anything, and the federal people who showed up told me to leave it alone. Federal people. That's what they called themselves. Suits. Credentials that looked right. They said the men had been relocated for their own safety under a federal protection program. Witnesses to something that happened overseas. Contractor fraud. Defense procurement corruption on a scale that would embarrass people who don't like being embarrassed. Ghost had positioned himself between the door and the group, lying flat with his head up and his ears tracking the engine sound that continued to grow outside. The dog's amber eyes reflected the lamplight in two steady points. "And you believed them? The federal people?" "I believed them because I wanted to. Because the alternative was that 4 men from my parish had been taken against their will by people wearing American credentials. And I was not prepared to live in a world where that was possible." I retired. I moved out here. I tried to forget. What changed? 6 months ago, I found a letter. One of the missing men's families asked me to help clean out a storage unit, stuffed behind a panel in the back. A letter from their son, addressed to his wife, postmarked 3 years after he supposedly died. He looked at Dawson with eyes that held the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent decades believing in a system and then discovered the system had been believing in itself. Those men are alive, hidden, not protected, controlled. Whoever is running the program stopped protecting them a long time ago. Now they're just keeping them quiet because letting them surface means the fraud comes out. And the fraud leads to people who have spent careers making sure it never does. And you started asking questions. I made calls I shouldn't have made, talked to people who talked to other people. And 3 weeks ago, someone came to my cabin while I was out fishing, searched it top to bottom, left everything just disturbed enough that I'd know they'd been there. It was a message. Stop looking. You didn't stop. I'm 68 years old. I spent 30 years keeping this parish safe. I wasn't going to spend my last years pretending 4 men I knew didn't exist. The engine sound outside was louder now, close enough that the pitch had resolved from a general rumble into the specific mechanical signature of a well-maintained outboard pushing through flooded channels. Ghost's ears had locked on the bearing, and his body had gone rigid. Is there anything in this bayou that connects back to proof? Documents, recordings, anything physical? Remy looked at him for a long moment. There's a name. The man running the program. The one who showed up at my cabin with the credentials and the story about protection. He came back 6 months ago when I started asking questions again. Different suit, same man, older, but I never forget a face. Who? He introduced himself as a federal liaison, but I've been a sheriff long enough to know the difference between a man who works for the government and a man who used to work for the government and now works for himself. He moved like military, talked like military, carried himself like someone who'd spent years giving orders in places where orders meant life and death. Something cold moved through Dawson's chest. Not fear, something older. The recognition of a pattern that was forming, whether he wanted it to or not. Did he give you a name? Maddox. He said his name was Maddox. The name landed in Dawson's body before it reached his mind. Maddox. The syllables detonated somewhere behind his sternum and sent a shockwave through 20 years of memory that he kept locked in a compartment he did not open. Not for therapists, not for bartenders, not for himself at 3 a.m. when the nightmares pushed him out of sleep and into the static silence of the bayou. Cade Maddox, Senior Chief, the man who had held the left side of every room Dawson entered first.
The man whose voice had been the last thing Dawson heard before the worst decision of his career. A decision that was not even his to make, but that he had carried the weight of every day since. Keep moving. We stop, we all die. Move.
I know him, Dawson said. Margot looked up from her father's ankle. Remy's eyes narrowed. How? He was in my team. Same platoon for 2 deployments, back when we were both still climbing the ladder. Went through the same pipeline, trained together, deployed together. He was the best operator I ever worked with. The cabin was silent, except for the rain and the engine sound and the small hiss of the kerosene lamp. Ghost turned his head from the door and looked at Dawson, and in the dog's amber eyes there was something that might have been concern if animals dealt in abstract emotions, or might have been the recognition that the man he depended on had just received information that changed the shape of everything. Remy spoke carefully. This man, Maddox, if he's who you say he is, then you know what we're dealing with. I know exactly what we're dealing with. The engine sound cut abruptly. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been. It meant the vessel had stopped. It meant whoever was aboard had reached a position they considered close enough to proceed on foot, or close enough to wait. We need to move, now! His ankle, can he stand? Remy answered by gripping the wall behind him and pulling himself upright. His face went gray with pain, but his legs held. I've been standing on worse than this for 30 years. Then we go north. There's a channel a quarter-mile back that's too narrow for their boat. We wade until we reach the wider water on the other side, and then... Ghost barked. Once. Sharp. Not at the door. At the wall. Dawson turned. Through the gaps between the planks, visible only because the lamp behind them cast light through the cracks, while the darkness outside cast nothing back. 2 shapes were moving across the flooded clearing, walking through waist-deep water, deliberately. One from the east, one from the west, converging on the cabin from 2 sides. They're here. Dawson killed the lamp with one quick motion, plunging the cabin into darkness. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The rain hammered the tin roof. The water gurgled against the pilings beneath the floor. And outside, the sound of 2 men moving through floodwater was audible now. The heavy sloshing of boots, pushing through waist-deep current, getting closer with each step. Margot, take your father to the back corner. Get low. Ghost. Here. The dog materialized beside his left leg, a shadow among shadows, silent as something that had never been domesticated. Dawson felt the heat of the dog's body against his calf and the tremor of controlled aggression running through Ghost's frame. The dog knew what this was. The training that had been layered into his nervous system by handlers who had prepared him for exactly this kind of moment was firing on every circuit, and Ghost was vibrating with the effort of containing it until the command came. Watch. The dog's growl dropped to a frequency below human hearing. His lips pulled back, his eyes fixed on the door. Dawson moved to the wall and pressed his eye to the widest gap between the planks. Through the narrow slit of visibility, he could see one of the figures approaching from the east, the tall one. Dale, or whatever his real name was. The man was wading chest deep now, his weapon held above the waterline in both hands, the practiced grip of someone who had learned to keep his sidearm dry in exactly these conditions. Behind him, barely visible through the rain, the second figure approached from the opposite side. Two-man approach, one from each flank. Textbook small team building clearance adapted for a single-room structure in a flood zone. Dawson had taught this exact methodology to junior operators. He knew its strengths, and he knew its weaknesses. The weakness was the door. A single-entry structure with one door meant both operators had to converge on the same point of entry, which meant there was a window of approximately 3 seconds between when the first man entered and when the second man could establish a position inside the room. 3 seconds. In a dark room. Against someone who knew the layout and had a 70-pound German Shepherd trained in controlled aggression. When I say down, you get your father flat on the floor and you cover him. Do not stand up until I tell you. Okay, the door, another door, years ago, dust instead of rain, heat instead of humidity. A room in a building in a country whose name he had been told not to remember. Point man position. First through the door. Always first. The weight of the weapon. The weight of the men behind him who trusted him to read the room before the room read them. And behind all of it, a voice in his earpiece. Calm. Certain. The voice of a man named Maddox. Go. The footsteps reached the walkway. The plank creaked under weight that was not Dawson's. The door burst inward. The tall man came through fast, weapon up, sweeping right to left. In a lit room, he would have found his targets in under a second. But the room was dark, and the 3 seconds Dawson needed were already counting. Dawson hit him from the left side of the doorframe, low, driving his right shoulder into the man's midsection with the full force of 210 pounds moving from a braced position. The impact folded the man in half and drove him sideways into the wall. The weapon discharged once into the ceiling, a sound like the world splitting open in the small enclosed space. Dawson trapped the man's weapon arm against his own body and twisted, the technique automatic, ingrained through 10,000 repetitions across 2 decades, and the sidearm clattered to the floor. Ghost launched. The second man was in the doorway, silhouetted against the slightly lighter darkness outside, and the dog hit him at the chest with 70 pounds of speed and controlled fury. The impact drove the man backward off the walkway and into the water below. Ghost went with him, jaws clamped around the man's forearm, and the sound that came from the water was half human scream and half the deep guttural snarl of an animal that had been bred and trained for precisely this moment. The tall man recovered faster than Dawson expected. He was trained. That much was obvious in the way he absorbed the initial hit and countered with an elbow strike that caught Dawson on the left shoulder. The bad shoulder. Pain detonated through the joint like a grenade going off inside the socket. And for 1 second, Dawson's left arm went numb from the shoulder to the fingertips. He did not stop. He could not afford to stop. He shifted his weight to the right side, trapped the man's striking arm with an overhook, and drove his forehead into the bridge of the man's nose. The impact was precise and devastating. The man's legs buckled. Dawson swept him to the ground, pinned him face down with a knee between the shoulder blades, and controlled both wrists behind the man's back with his one functioning hand, while the other arm hung at his side, sending signals of damage that he filed away for later. In the water below the walkway, the second man had stopped struggling. Ghost held the arm lock with the patient mechanical pressure of a dog that would maintain its grip until specifically commanded to release, regardless of what the rest of the body attached to the arm was doing. The man was gasping and thrashing, but making no progress. Ghost's eyes were calm above the clenched jaws. The dog's breathing was steady. This was the work he had been built for. "Down," Dawson said to Margot. Then, realizing it was over, "It's clear. You can move." The lamp reignited in Margot's hands, her fingers steady despite what she had just witnessed. The small flame threw the cabin into sharp relief. The tall man lay face down on the floor, with Dawson's knee on his back. A thin line of blood ran from his nose across the planks. His weapon lay against the far wall, where it had slid after being stripped. Remy Thibodeau stood in the corner, upright on his damaged ankle, his face pale, but his eyes sharp. The old sheriff had not flinched, had not made a sound, had watched the violence unfold with the particular detachment of a man who had seen enough in his career to know the difference between chaos and controlled force. "You're not a boat driver." "No." "Ghost! Aus!" The command carried through the rain. Below the walkway, Ghost released the arm. The dog did not retreat. He stood in the chest-deep water beside the man he had downed, eyes fixed, waiting. A sentinel carved from muscle and discipline and absolute loyalty to the voice that had spoken. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing. Blood dripped from his chin onto the floor. "I asked you a question." "You know who sent us." Dawson did know. He had known since Remy said the name. Had known, if he was honest, since he saw the boot prints on his dock, and the blade cuts on the radio, and the GPS hardware that came from a world he had spent 3 years trying to forget. He had known the way a body knows the shape of an old wound, even after the scar has faded, by the particular ache it produces when the weather changes. "Yeah," Dawson said. "I do." He secured the tall man's wrists with paracord from his pack, tight enough to hold, not tight enough to cut circulation. He had learned the difference in places he did not discuss. Then he climbed down to the water, secured the second man the same way, and walked him up the walkway into the cabin. Ghost following close behind, still watching, still ready. 2 men, bound and sitting against the wall. 1 German shepherd lying between them and the door, alert. 1 retired sheriff with a shattered ankle and a story that had nearly gotten him killed. 1 woman with a medical bag and hands that did not shake. And 1 man who had come into this bayou to find a lost old man and had instead found the ghost of a brotherhood he thought he had left behind. The storm broke sometime before dawn. The change was not dramatic. There was no moment of sudden silence or revelation of stars. The rain simply thinned, degree by degree, until the drops falling through the canopy above the clearing were individually audible, rather than collectively deafening. The wind lost its voice. The water, which had been rising for 3 days, paused and held, as if the bayou had taken a breath and was deciding whether to exhale. Dawson stood on the walkway outside the cabin and watched the first light arrive. It came from the east, gray at first, and then gradually warming to a pale gold that filtered through the Spanish moss and laid itself across the surface of the floodwater in long, quiet stripes. The cypress trees that had been invisible for days emerged from the mist like columns of a cathedral being built around him as he watched. His left shoulder had swollen to the point where the joint refused to rotate above chest height. His knee had stiffened into a compromise that allowed forward motion but protested lateral movement. His ribs, which had absorbed an elbow strike during the fight that he had not fully registered at the time, sent sharp messages with each deep breath. Ghost sat beside him on the walkway, fur still damp, nose lifted to the morning air. The dog's body language had shifted overnight, from operational vigilance to the quieter state of an animal who recognized that the immediate threat had passed. His ears still rotated, cataloging sound. His nose still worked, sampling scent. But the tremor of contained aggression was gone. In its place was the steady, patient presence that Ghost carried during the hours between missions. The dog simply being with his person, asking nothing, offering everything. "Hey," Dawson said. Ghost's tail moved once. "You did good, boy. You did real good." The dog leaned against his leg, and Dawson let his hand rest on the broad skull, fingers moving through the coarse fur behind the ears. And for a moment, the two of them existed in a space that contained nothing except the weight of trust and the light coming through the trees. The two men's bass boat was anchored 200 yards to the northeast, in a section of wide channel sheltered by a natural levee of fallen timber. Dawson found it by following the route Ghost indicated, the dog tracking the men's scent trail backward through the flood to the vessel they had arrived on. It was a 20-foot aluminum hull with a center console and a 150 horsepower outboard, well maintained, equipped with electronics that Dawson disconnected and left in the water. He motored it back to the cabin and loaded the group. Remy lay across the center bench, with his damaged leg elevated on Margot's medical bag. Margot sat beside him, one hand on his shoulder, the other holding an IV bag she had rigged from her kit, the saline drip replacing some of what 3 days in a swamp had taken from a 68-year-old body. The two bound men sat in the bow under Ghost's supervision, the dog positioned between them and the rest of the group with the specific posture that communicated, clearly and without ambiguity, that any movement toward the people behind him would be the last voluntary movement they made. Dawson drove. The bayou in the morning after a storm was a different world than the bayou during one. The water was still high, the channels still swollen beyond their normal banks, but the violence was gone. The surface lay flat and dark and still, reflecting the trees and the sky in a mirror so perfect that the line between real and reflection dissolved into something that felt less like a physical environment and more like a painting of one. Dawson navigated north by reading the current and the tree line, and the way the light fell across the water. The same way he had navigated south 2 days earlier, except now he knew the route, and the morning was quiet, and the dog beside him was calm, and the woman behind him was safe, and her father was breathing. They reached the wide channel where the bayou opened up near Bayou Crew, and Dawson recognized the stretch of water from the cold open. The same channel. The same cane wall on the western bank where Ghost had barked into the darkness 2 nights ago. The same water, the same moss, the same ancient trees. But the storm was gone, and the light was different, and the boat was different, and the man driving it was different too, in ways he could not yet articulate, but could feel accumulating in his chest, like silt building at the bend of a river. The dock at Bayou Crew came into view through the thinning mist. A parish sheriff's cruiser was parked at the gravel lot. A man in a tan uniform stood on the dock, waiting. "You called ahead?" "When we got within range. The radio on this boat works." Dawson brought the vessel alongside the dock and cut the engine. Ghost jumped onto the planks first and shook himself, sending water in a wide arc that caught the morning light and turned momentarily into a halo of gold droplets before falling back to the wood. The parish sheriff stepped forward, a man in his 50s with a heavy build and careful eyes, and began the process of taking custody of the 2 bound men, while Margot guided a stretcher team down the dock to her father. Dawson stood on the dock and watched the organized chaos of rescue and jurisdiction unfold around him. Remy was lifted onto the stretcher, and as the paramedics carried him up the dock toward the waiting ambulance, the old man reached out and gripped Dawson's hand. The grip was strong despite everything. The grip of a man who had held authority for decades and who understood that some debts could not be paid with words. "Thank you. Your daughter found me. Your dog found you. The dog found the cabin. You found the reason to walk into it." Dawson held the grip for a moment, then released it. Remy was carried up the dock. Margot walked beside the stretcher, her hand on her father's arm. The parish sheriff approached Dawson 20 minutes later with a notepad and the expression of a man who had more questions than the morning could accommodate. "Sir, I'm going to need a full statement about what happened out there. 2 men pursued and threatened a retired officer of the law in his home. We found him. They found us. I restrained them. And the men, they say they were conducting a private security operation. Authorized." "Authorized by who?" The sheriff hesitated. "They haven't said, but their equipment isn't the kind you buy at a sporting goods store." Dawson looked past the sheriff, toward the water, toward the bayou that stretched south and west into the maze where Remy Thibodeau had hidden for 3 days with a secret that had nearly cost him his life. He thought about the 4 men, veterans, alive somewhere in a system that had stopped protecting them and started containing them. He thought about what would happen if the full truth entered the official record. The investigation, the scrutiny, the institutional machinery that would grind into motion and would, inevitably, alert the very people who had built the containment system in the first place. He thought about Cade Maddox, about the man who had held the left side of every doorway, about the voice that had said, "Keep moving," in a tone that carried no doubt, about the fact that Cade had not come to the bayou himself, had sent proxies instead, which meant either he trusted these men enough to delegate, or he was watching from a distance to see how the situation resolved before committing. If Dawson told the sheriff everything, the system would take over. Reports would be filed, agencies would be notified, and somewhere in that chain of notification, a flag would be raised, and the people who had spent 8 years keeping 4 men hidden, would learn that their containment had been compromised. And then those 4 men, wherever they were, would be moved, or silenced, or disappeared again, this time permanently, because the cost of exposure had become too high. If Dawson said nothing, Remy would be safe. The 2 men in custody would face charges for assault and unlawful pursuit. Cade Maddox would know that his operation had been discovered, but not destroyed, and the 4 veterans would remain where they were, alive but hidden, existing in a gray space between safety and captivity that was ugly and unjust, but at least was still breathing. There was no clean answer. There never was. 20 years in the teams had taught him that the choice was rarely between right and wrong. It was between degrees of damage. And the operator's job was to choose the degree that left the most people standing. They assaulted and pursued a retired sheriff. That's what I saw. That's what happened. The rest is above both our pay grades. Keep Remy Thibodeau safe. That's what matters right now. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. The man had been in law enforcement long enough to know when a witness was telling the truth, and when a witness was telling a version of the truth that had been shaped by forces beyond the scope of a parish investigation. He chose not to push. "Copy that," Dawson nodded. The word landed in his ear with a familiarity that ached, and he turned away before it could settle. The bayou healed faster than anyone expected. Within 3 days of the storm's passing, the water had receded enough that the channels returned to their normal banks, and the mudflats re-emerged along the shoreline, steaming gently in the October sun. Birds returned to the canopy. Fish surfaced in the shallows. The Spanish moss, which had been whipped and torn by the wind, settled back into its slow curtains between the branches, catching the light in the early mornings in a way that made the bayou look like a place that had never known violence of any kind. Remy Thibodeau was in the parish hospital, his ankle properly splinted and his body responding to the kind of care that only rest and IV fluids and his daughter's relentless attention could provide. He would recover. The doctors said 6 weeks. Remy said 4. Margot said he would stay in bed, as long as she told him to, and not a minute less. And the tone in which she said it suggested that even a man who had stared down criminals for 3 decades knew better than to argue with a daughter who had inherited his stubbornness and refined it. Dawson stood on the dock at the south edge of Bayou Crew on the 4th morning after the storm. The sun had not yet cleared the tree line, and the light was that particular amber gold that only existed for 20 minutes each day, when the angle was low enough to pass through the Spanish moss horizontally and turn every strand into a filament of warm copper. The water was still. The air was cool for the first time in months, carrying the clean edge of a front that had followed the storm down from the north. Ghost lay beside him on the dock, not on alert, not working, simply lying on the sun-warmed planks with his chin on his paws and his eyes half closed, breathing the slow, even breath of a dog who was exactly where he wanted to be. Dawson held a mug of coffee in his right hand. His left arm hung at his side, the shoulder still swollen, but beginning to respond to the kind of passive recovery that rest and ibuprofen and the absence of immediate threat could provide. He looked at the water and did not see the water. he saw 3 years of mornings exactly like this one. Mornings when he had stood on this dock and felt nothing except the familiar absence that had become the defining feature of his interior landscape. The absence of the teams. The absence of purpose. The absence of a reason to be in any specific place rather than any other. This morning felt different, and the difference lived in the part of his chest where he had stopped expecting things to live. Ghost's ear rotated first, then his tail moved. One slow wag, then stillness again. Footsteps on the dock, not hurried, not hesitant. The steady pace of someone who had made a decision before they started walking and was now simply executing it. Margot came down the dock carrying 2 cups of coffee. She was wearing a flannel shirt he did not recognize as his own until he realized it was, in fact, his own, retrieved from the stilt cabin at some point he had not been awake enough to notice. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders, still damp. She looked like she had slept for the first time in a week, which she probably had. "Thought you might want company." He took the cup. Their fingers touched for a moment during the transfer, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as they might have 3 days ago. Ghost stood up, stretched, walked to a position between them, and lay down again, with his head resting on Dawson's boot and his tail curled against Margot's ankle. The exact position he had held on the boat during the storm. But the storm was gone. Margot looked down at the dog and smiled. It was the first unguarded smile Dawson had seen her wear. The kind that arrived before the person wearing it had time to decide whether it was appropriate, and it changed her face in a way that made the morning light seem to deepen around her. Dawson looked at the oaks across the water. Ancient trees, hung with moss, standing in the shallows where they had stood for centuries. Margot's voice came back to him from the bayou, 2 days and a lifetime ago. These oaks remember every prayer ever whispered under them. He had not prayed. Not then. Not now. But standing on the dock, with the coffee warm in his hand and the dog at his feet and the woman beside him, and the bayou stretching out in all directions like a living thing that had decided to include him in its inventory, he said a word so quietly that only Ghost could hear it. "Thank you." He did not know who he was saying it to. The dog, the woman, the oaks, the God who may or may not have been listening from somewhere inside the moss and the water and the light. It did not matter. The word left his mouth and entered the morning and became part of whatever the bayou kept. Margot sipped her coffee and looked at the water. What happens now? Dawson looked at Ghost. The dog looked back with amber eyes that held nothing except the present moment and the absolute trust that whatever the man decided, it would be enough. "I don't know." The first real smile, just a trace. "But I'm not going anywhere." Margot did not answer. She did not need to. She stood beside him on the dock, and the space between them was neither close nor far, but exactly the distance 2 people maintained when they had decided to stop running in opposite directions, and had not yet decided what came next, but knew
with the quiet certainty that arrives after storms, that standing still was no longer the same thing as standing alone. The sun cleared the tree line. The light poured through the Spanish moss and turned the bayou into a cathedral of green and gold. 3 shadows stretched across the dock and reached the water, where they lay together on the still surface, like a painting of something that had not existed 3 days ago, and now, somehow, did. Dawson Briggs, Margot Thibodeau,
And Ghost, lying between them with his eyes closed and his breathing slow and his body warm against their feet. A 70-pound bridge between 2 people who had walked into the dark together and found, on the other side, a reason to stand in the light. The bayou held them, the oaks remembered, and the silence between them was not empty anymore.